Good morning, or good late morning. Welcome to our Postdoctoral Research Symposium. This is a symposium that we have to showcase the work of the Earth Institute postdoctoral researchers. We do it every once a semester. What you'll see today is 5 of the postdocs. There are more than 5, so by the time you come next semester and then next semester, you'll see everybody. You'll see from the program that there is no particular thematic area that the postdocs are working in. They range quite a bit, and that's done intentionally. We aim to try to cover most of the areas of research at the Earth Institute and do that reasonably well. But the overarching idea is to have a program that meets the challenges of sustainable development in a changing world, and that is the only theme. So you'll see very different people come up with very different ideas. We have 5 speakers. They'll go continuously. There won't be a break. We are in the process of starting the selection for the next group of postdoctoral fellows. And one of our search committee members is here, and I thank him and all the others who are helping us select from what has turned out to be the largest application pool that we've had. Is that right? Second largest. Okay. Almost the largest, but we're very pleased with that. So my name's John Mutter, as you can tell from the program. I am the director of the program, which mostly means that I look after the selection process and answer in the very few questions that Sam Ostrowski cannot answer, but she does most of the work on the program. So I'm saying this now because I occasionally forget to thank the right people at the end of these sort of proceedings. So that's about all I'm going to say. If I can think of something else, I'll say it at the end. So we'll begin with Winslow Hansen, who will talk about global hotspots of forest priming to climate variability.
Thanks everyone for being here today. Really excited to present some of the work that I've been doing as part of the EI postdoc program for the last year or so. One of the great things about this program is you have an extraordinary amount of freedom to make collaborative networks with people, and I've really enjoyed this process. Many of them are co-authors on this paper, and so I want to acknowledge their contributions. Some of them are folks here at Columbia or alumni of Columbia, but also others around the country and the world. I'd also like to acknowledge funding, of course, from the Earth Institute, but also from Center for Climate and Life. So I'm a forest ecologist, and we're really thinking a lot about how forests might prove to be increasingly stressed by climate change. It's becoming pretty apparent that the resilience of forests around the world might be exceeded by coming changes, and so an extraordinary amount of attention is being focused on thinking through how these long-term transient shifts in climate might influence forest processes. However, climate variability, or the variation of climate around those mean conditions, are also projected to change and have really influential effects on forest processes. In fact, it could be that climate variability, rather than long-term changes in the mean, could have larger effects on forests in the near term. Just one example. Recently, like 2012 to 2015, California experienced the most severe drought they had in 1,200 years, so unusual anomalies from the mean soil moisture conditions, and this led to millions of trees being killed, right? So we know that climate variability can have very strong effects. But across forest ecology, we're missing a predictive framework for thinking through and trying to figure out where and why forests might be most sensitive to climate variability. And the reason for that is a couple-fold. One in particular is that just trying to predict patterns of climate variability is very difficult because they're driven by these dynamic interactions between the Earth's surface and the atmosphere. But also, there's going to be a whole series of biotic and abiotic filters that dictate how they influence forests. And so the group that I mentioned earlier got together and we started to think through, well, can we come up with a framework for thinking through where forests might prove to be sensitive? And we came up with this hypothesis the forest priming hypothesis. And the idea of it is that forests are going to have wider physiological tolerances in places where they had experienced larger climate variability, because that primes them to cope with it. So in this figure, what we're looking at here is a forest cell through time in one period over here. And that is the mean climate conditions it's experiencing, and then the variability around that mean. And you can see that the variability in climate approaches and sometimes exceeds the physiological limits of the organisms or trees that are there. What that does is exerts selective pressure, which causes those physiological limits to widen, so that in a subsequent time period, when they experience perhaps even larger climate variability, they're well primed to handle it. There's a message coming up here. There we go. In contrast, where there are places that climate was relatively stable, they're not going to have that pressure exerted on them, and so they won't be as primed. They'll be more sensitive. So in this case, the same situation, we have a forest that's experiencing far more stable climate that doesn't come close to pushing the physiological limits of the species. And so those tolerances don't widen, and when larger climate variability occurs in a subsequent period, they prove to be sensitive. So as with anything in the world, no idea is completely new, right? And so there is decades of foundational work that has led up to the hypothesis that we're posing here, including roots at Columbia University, which is kind of fun. So this guy, Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was a famous evolutionary biologist, thought a lot about this and came up with this idea that how variable an environment is really influences whether species are generalists or specialists. And he thought plants in the tropics, where temperature is relatively stable throughout the year, are going to evolve to be thermal specialists. They can handle a narrow range of conditions because that's what they've been exposed to. But at higher latitudes, where they see wider ranges of temperatures throughout the year, those species are going to be generalists. The difference between 60 years ago or whatever it was and today at Columbia University is that we can actually use remote sensing data and global climate data to test some of these ideas. And so that's what I've been working on for the last several years. We started with gridded data on forests and climate at a half-degree spatial resolution. The forest data is annual monthly maximum enhanced vegetation index for the satellite record, 2000 to 2018. And this is just a satellite-derived measure of greenness, which is a composite property of things like leaf area, chlorophyll, canopy structure. The climate data is a CREW product, so it's a global gridded, interpolated climate product between the stations of the world that measure weather. And this provided annual maximum monthly temperature, annual precipitation, and annual vapor pressure deficit. So what are we talking about when we're thinking about forest sensitivity to climate variability? We're really trying to get at how do forests respond relative to the magnitude of climate variability they're exposed to. And here's a figure that's trying to illustrate this. So here we have on the top panel how forests in two different grid cells are responding through time, so 2000 to 2018. And this is our metric of EVI. So that's just the measurement of forest response. But on the bottom, we can see that these two cells, despite the fact that they're having the exact same response, are being exposed to radically different temperature regimes. So cell I, you can see temperature doesn't vary very much from year to year compared to cell J. And so we might suggest that, in fact, cell I is more sensitive to temperature variability because it has the same response as cell J, but experiences far less variability in temperature. And so we can actually come up with a metric to try to measure that. And this is the metric that we're using in the paper, forest sensitivity to climate variability, which is defined as the standard deviation, so a measure of variance in the climate variable in the forest variable from the mean, relative to the climate variability that it's experiencing. So this gives us a sense of how much forests are changing in response to changes in the climate. And this metric then allows us to ask, well, how does forest sensitivity to climate variability in this 2000 to 2018 window vary with the magnitude of past climate variability? And if the forest priming hypothesis is going to hold, what we would expect to see is lower forest sensitivity in places that experienced larger climate variability in the past. Indeed, when we look across the world's forests, that's exactly what we see. So here we're looking at how sensitive forests were to temperature variability between 2000 and 2018 on the y-axis as a function of the variability in temperature in a past period, so 1950 to 1999, for all of the world's forests. And you can see that globally, we do see decreases in forest sensitivity in places that had higher climate variability in the past, consistent with that hypothesis. We see the exact same patterns for precipitation and for vapor pressure deficit. So this gives us a thought of, well, maybe there is some evidence for this hypothesis, right? Based on that, we can actually start to plot out, well, where are the places in the world where forests are most primed or most sensitive to climate variability? This is the map for temperature. So you can see that the boreal and high latitude forests up high in the northern hemisphere seem to be pretty uniformly primed to temperature variability, whereas the tropics are far more sensitive to temperature variability. Things get a little more interesting when we start to look at how sensitive forests are to precipitation variability, and we see a lot more heterogeneity within biomes than across biomes. So here in the tropics, we see hotspots of sensitivity along the periphery of the core Amazon and the Congo Basin, which is really interesting because these are places that my colleague has found to be bistable between savanna and dense forest states, mediated by mean annual precipitation. So this very much aligns with us finding these sensitive and variability in that precipitation. We also find hotspots of sensitivity in the North American boreal forest, which is consistent with tree ring studies that have documented trees in the North American boreal, their growth are constrained under unusually hot, dry conditions. And we see similar patterns of heterogeneity across biomes to vapor pressure deficit. These results do provide some nice evidence that forest priming may be occurring in these forests. We did find that forests are less sensitive to climate variability where past climate variability was large, and that's pretty cool. But it turns out that this may not be just a property of forest systems, and in fact is a property of many different types of complex systems. We know that complex systems adapt and learn to past stressors, and there's a number of examples of where memory can play a role. So for example, in the Great Barrier Reef, corals were exposed to heat stress in 2016 and 2017, and the bleaching that occurred after the 2017 heat stress was far less than after the 2016. Children that are exposed to germs very early in life appear to have lower incidence of some infections later on, and even small island nations that are exposed to external economic shocks generally seem to adopt some policies that make them a little more resilient to subsequent shocks, which is kind of interesting. What do these results portend for the future? Well, it's really difficult to predict how climate variability is going to change, but the best that we can do suggests that temperature variability could increase, and in particular in the tropics. This is a map from another study showing across a suite of general circulation models of climate how much temperature variability is likely to increase by 2100. And you can see that the Amazon basin that we found is already quite sensitive to temperature variability lights up. Precipitation variability is projected to increase modestly across the world. This is a map showing how much temperature variability, precip variability could increase with as a percentage per 1 degree Kelvin warming over the next 100 years. So given these projections, it seems really critical to think about and quantify where and why forests are likely to be most sensitive. And this study is a first step in that direction, but obviously a lot of work needs to be done to follow up. And it's also going to be critical to think about how we can quantify decadal scale consequences for ecosystem services that are really important for humanity. So how do we move forward? Well, fundamentally, what we're documenting at global scales is an emergent property of a hierarchically structured system. And what I mean by that is it's environmental drivers acting on very fine-scale forest processes, like individual tree mortality, that then aggregates to the global scale that we're documenting. And so I think it's really a ripe time to start thinking about how we can design experiments across forest biomes to identify how climate variability is influencing those forest processes and what are the origin mechanisms through which these global scale properties seem to be emerging. It's also a really exciting time to think about how to move forward at a broader scale because there's a whole series of remote sensing instruments that have either been launched or are about to launch that are going to characterize forest structure and function at far better and more rigorous resolutions and scales and perspectives than we can get with EVI. So actually explicitly measuring structure and biomass of forests, water stress, canopy chemical composition. And so as that record lengthens, it's going to be a really nice way to further evaluate this hypothesis. But also, even in the meantime, we could use this to design real-time warning systems to figure out where forest sensitivity is changing and where forests might be most vulnerable to help triage and inform climate adaptation strategies. And then finally, to get those decadal scale projections of the consequences, ecosystem modeling is essential, and this is where a lot of my work is when I'm not doing this kind of stuff. We have landscape models that are extremely well suited to start figuring out how climate affects forests up to hundreds to thousands of kilometers, because they're explicitly representing the forest processes that we know climate has a strong effect on. But at global scales, we're just beginning to start represent forest demography at sufficient resolution to capture and answer some of these questions. And so it's a really exciting time to start thinking about how we can use those models at the global scale. We need to use both to start using scenario-based approaches where we integrate both climate variability and long-term shifts in mean conditions to figure out how forests are likely to respond, and then to also document what the consequences might be for a whole suite of ecosystem services that are important for our survival and persistence and quality of life. Thanks. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Yeah, we've got time for a few questions, but I want to make a comment.
Yeah.
And you don't need to respond to it.
Okay.
But it occurred to me that, you know, a lot of the sciences that we need to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future didn't develop as predictive sciences. Mm-hmm. In fact, Charles Darwin was criticized extensively by physicists at the time because his theory couldn't predict anything. Well, it was never trying to. Mm-hmm. But now we sort of have to retool our sciences to become predictive sciences when they never grew up being that way. Mm-hmm. Do you agree?
Well, yeah, certainly, but it's also a really exciting time to be able to think about the theory like Darwin did, and then actually take a stab at testing it. And so you get this feedback loop of one feeding into the other.
Right, but all of which is really, you know, in the scale of things, quite new.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. So, sorry.
For the forest priming hypothesis, whether scared of those things. For the forest priming hypothesis, do you know how much? I mean, is it possible to know how much of this is selection versus how do you call it? Like within life, individual adaptation of a tree.
Yeah, like plasticity and traits.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. So, of course, using this broad-scale approach, we're not actually trying to figure out what any of those mechanisms might be and the relative importance of natural selection versus plasticity and the functional traits through which trees are responding. But that's why those experimental approaches could be so essential, because that would allow us to start untangling how important the long time periods of natural selection are versus how much of this is inherently baked into individuals that are on the planet today. And that's going to be crucial information for thinking about how forests are going to adapt and what steps we might need to take to steward forest ecosystems.
I haven't heard you say much about the human sort of overprint, thinking about logging, collecting fuel wood, maintaining clear areas under power lines. How do you deal with that in this type of analysis?
Yeah, totally. So I spent a lot of time very carefully masking out cells where that could have a strong impact so that we just have a set of cells that are clearly, as much as we can, clearly forests that haven't had a large impact like that. And of course, there's going to be cells that have some impact, and that's just unavoidable doing these global scale analyses. But that's where I think using multiple approaches to further characterize and evaluate this would be really essential. And it would be really exciting to start to think about not just trying to get rid of humans, but think about how humans are mediating these outcomes. Would be really fun to explore.
Okay, that's at the back, and it's the last one. Please.
Yeah, thanks, nice talk. I have one question. So when you showed the map, of the sensitivity, so how much of that can you relate to just the ratio of seasonal cycle to just the internal variability? Because a lot of the range you would just get from seasonal cycle as you move north, right? But in the meantime, what becomes interesting is as you start thinking of climate change, a lot of the variability will happen actually in the trend in the tropics. So the interannual variability will start basically being beefed up in a sense,
Can you repeat the second half of the question? I missed
so
it.
in a sense, if you superimpose climate change on top of that, that will lead to a very big impact, especially in the tropics, in terms of the trend you will see in the temperature. And as you said, because you have a very narrow range you need to accommodate.
Right.
And it seems that you would be much more susceptible there because, you're kind of used to that on an annual basis, in the northern latitudes, I don't know if you could comment on that.
So for the first part of it, by using the interannual variability, so we're looking at temperature variability year to year rather than seasonal, and so we're trying to control for the fact that there's large seasonal fluctuations at higher latitudes. And then for the second part of the question, I think that is a really interesting thing to think about, and there's been work trying to map out at least like conceptually how interactions between mean changes in climate and variability could cause systems to be pushed over their thermal maxima. My interest here was in some ways to start thinking about climate variability separate from changes in mean conditions, because even in those settings where they're talking about both, the focus seems to often be on the long-term transient changes. And my hope was to be able to emphasize that, hey, this is important in and of itself, in addition to those interactions with mean changes in climate.